Resuming debate, the honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I will be splitting my time with the member from Hochelaga. Ironically, Madam Speaker, I had occasion to repair my deck. Normally, I would ask somebody else to do it, but these are strange times, so I thought I would apply my formidable carpentry skills to the repairs. To no one's great surprise, it's clear that I should try to keep my day job. While my lack of carpentry skills should not be a shock, the price of lumber certainly was, as was raised in the previous exchange. $51 for a 16-foot cedar deck board, 3 times last year's price. And I considered myself to get any after owning 4 lumber yards, 2 of which had nothing at all. Now my simple job was going to cost me $75 for a 4x2 square in materials alone. If I was intending to replace the entire structure, I probably would have had to put a mortgage on the house. Now, mortgage money is really cheap these days, and that really underlines the real estate frenzy that the previous exchange outlined. Cheap money is also the underlying assumption of this budget. The related assumption is that the Bank of Canada can keep its commitment to an inflation target of below 2%. The government and the Bank of Canada are backed up by the best economists in Canada who provide consensus opinions to the Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Bank of Canada, upon which all projections are based. GDP projections, nominal GDP projections, inflation projections, interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. Everything starts and ends with consensus numbers, and that in turn allows the government to know what its revenue will be, and in turn its deficit projections. But what if the experts are wrong, that they're measuring the wrong things, that the basket used to calculate inflation is made up of quite a number of goods and services, some of which are questionable in a pandemic economy? For instance, no one's traveling these days, Madam Speaker, so travel is actually deflationary, along with all of the related services and goods that go with travel. So my deck board, on the other hand, that's quite inflationary. Or a trip to the grocery store is exactly the opposite, quite inflationary. Now, in normal times, this all balances off. However, these are not normal times, and we need to be more than a little skeptical about these predictions. In a November article in the Globe and Mail report on business, the writer took on the post-March pandemic predictions of the leading economists, and here's what he found. Canada's best economists predicted, 1, that there would be a significant weakening of the Canadian dollar. Reality, after a brief hit, it was followed by a full recovery. Prediction number 2, equity markets will take years to recover. Reality, markets took months to recover, and they have been on a tear ever since. Some might even say irrational exuberance. 3, that the GDP will plunge. Reality, it did plunge. It has recovered quickly and with not much ground to make up to pre-pandemic levels. In fact, you may have caught the reports by the Bank of Canada that's revising the GDP growth up to 6.5%, which is higher than the government's predictions as of Monday. So things are changing rather quickly. 4, housing starts will plummet. Reality, the housing starts are thriving and the real estate market is, some say, insane. I appreciate that these are challenging times, but apparently being an economist means never having to say you're sorry. Now, Mr. Speaker, you might say that I'm just ranting on about economists, and that might be just a little bit true, even if some of the economists I know are some of the nicest and smartest people I know. Mr. Speaker, the fact remains that some of the nicest and smartest people you or I know this time last year got it far more wrong than they got it right. That puts the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance in a dodgy position. The spending demands far exceed the ability of the economy to support. It's one thing to provide emergency support, but it's quite another thing to provide that support over the short or medium term. Simply not sustainable. Speaker, I don't know what a 1% interest rate jump does to the budget, but I do know that 2% is probably quite devastating. Many decades ago, I was doing mortgages for my legal clients in the 17 to 18% range for 5-year fixed rates. I wish I'd had the foresight to load up on long-term Canadian savings bonds at 13%. However, I didn't. I don't claim any unique insight, but to those who claim it couldn't happen again, I say, think again. Remember the inflation wars of the 70s and 80s, stagflation, I suppose it was called at the time. Remember wage and price controls. Remember Canada being an honorary member of the Third World. Remember the draconian financial disciplines of the 90s and early 2000s. Remember the banking crisis of 2008, 2009, where financial institutions were severely overleveraged, and CEOs were buying fancy financial instruments that they didn't even seem to understand. I also remember the wise words of Ed Clark, former CEO of the TD Bank, who said he wouldn't buy anything for his bank that he didn't understand. Good investment advice. Mr. Speaker, we are in a time where no one really knows what's going on or will go on. I didn't read the last year's predictions to embarrass some people. I read them to remind everyone that we are in perilous times. And as long as the pandemic remains in our midst, economic prognostications, even consensus ones, can't necessarily be relied upon. So the question has become, has the government of Canada taken us too far to a step to the abyss? A little history might provide some comfort, however, Madam Speaker. In 1946, immediate post-war World War II, the net debt to GDP was 110%. 110%, Madam Speaker. Some 8 years later, by 54 or 55, it was down to 38%, largely reduced by tight spending and a prosperous expanding economy. By the 75-76 fiscal year, it was down to 14%, and then it took off to the point in 96-97 where debt to GDP was 67%, and it was considered by all, particularly the economists, to be unsustainable. You'll remember the New York Times article about Canada being an honorary member of the Third World. With fiscal and monetary discipline and an expanding economy, the government of the day was not only able to bring down the debt to GDP ratio to below 30%, but the government actually paid off $100 billion in actual real debt. I would note that fiscal targets were set and a contingency fund was created so that everyone knew the plan. The 30% net to GDP has hovered there ever since 2006 to 2018. While history may teach us something, it doesn't teach us everything. We may be in the immediate post-World War economy, or we may be in something else. I think I've said enough about what I think about economists' predictions. The other unknown is how the virus will behave. It's demonstrated a devastating resiliency, attacking populations that were once thought to be safe. So it's hard to know whether we've reached an armistice with the enemy or whether there will be still a full-on war or whether there's just a few battles left to mop up. The finance minister is making a series of what I would argue are reasonable bets. One, the economy will grow its way out. She has some evidence to support her position. And as I indicated earlier, the Bank of Canada yesterday revised its expectations for the growth of the economy upwards quite dramatically, even higher than what the projection is set out last Monday by the finance minister. The second bet is that inflation is still within the band. I'm a touch more skeptical for reasons outlined above, but again, not an unreasonable assumption and one of the monetary tools left by the governor of the Bank of Canada to keep the expansion of the economy going. Three, short-term interest rates will remain low. How long is short-term, Madam Speaker? I'm not quite sure. I am again a little skeptical about that. 4, that the fall deficit projection of 382 billion came down to 354 billion, quite true, and did show some evidence that the government's plan was working. 5, that the government...
Unfortunately, the honourable member's time for debate is up, but he'll be able to add during questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I do thank my colleague who's been here for a while and has some very valuable insight in terms of historical and things that happen over time. You know, clearly when I saw this budget, 700 plus pages with essentially extraordinary debt spending and extraordinary, you know, decisions around support for many, many different items, I worry about when the quote is when we will have to pay the piper. Part of our amendment suggests that we are concerned that this government, in an election budget, they've given things away, but they're not talking about the hard choices they're going to make. Does this minister guarantee, or does this member guarantee that there will never be capital gains on private homes?
The honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
One is not in the business of issuing guarantees on anything that one can't control, Madam Speaker. So, but she is justifiably worried about can we pay it, and I think the real question is are the finance minister's assumptions realistic under the circumstances? The other assumption that I'd add in, didn't get a chance to, is that the United States is proposing, President Biden is proposing a $2.3 trillion proposal for effectively stimulus spending. And Canada will be well positioned to pick up on that uptake, and in spite of the Buy American provisions. So I agree it's 700 pages. I agree we are in perilous times. Has the Minister of Finance, so the test is, has the Minister of Finance made some reasonable assumptions? I believe at this stage she has. In fact, they're probably the only assumption she can make.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Trois-Rivières.
The honourable member for Trois-Rivières. The honourable member for Trois-Rivières.
Honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for his comments, especially around economists. I know I once heard a respected conservative economist said that economists exist to make astrologers look good. But I want to ask him about taxing the ultra wealthy to help pay back this pandemic debt. It's the low income Canadians that have been really impacted by this. People have lost their jobs. Some people have lost their lives. Why hasn't the government brought in a wealth tax? 80% of Canadians want a wealth tax on the ultra wealthy. Instead, we get a luxury tax on, 10% on your latest Ferrari or yacht. So why hasn't the government taken the bold step to bring in a wealth tax that we need to, so that the wealthy are paying this debt down?
The honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood. The honourable for Scarborough-Guildwood. I don't know if individuals are not putting their mics on, but
okay. Yes, I apologize. I'm not quite sure how I got turned off. May I say to the honourable member that I don't own a yacht or a fancy car, unless you call a Subaru a fancy car. The short answer, I think, is that wealth taxes don't work, and when they've been tried, they've been abandoned. The most effective wealth tax that we do have is capital gains tax, and I expect that given the irrational exuberance of some of the real estate sales, that in fact there will be quite a significant windfall to the government on the sale of assets.
We'll try again, the member for Trois-Rivières. I think the problem was that the member was muted. Thank you, Madam Speaker. A brief question, please. Yes. I'd like to thank the member for Scarborough for his speech. There's huge spending, never before seen spending. and huge deficits will result, but nothing about increasing health transfers. What does the member have to say about that?
From the member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And what I would say about that is simply that the government has provided massive amounts of stimulus into the economy in order that provincial governments survive and service their own jurisdictional responsibilities. So the transfers to provinces are unprecedented in the past 18 months, and the provinces have, by and large, I think, spent the money quite wisely on health and other related issues.